I want to welcome everybody uh, joining the series of 8830 Leadership Chats. Uh, we have some great hosts, Nick Pad, Lakeshore, Disability in Sport, North American Federation of Adaptive Physical Activity, and also the International Federation of Adaptive Physical Activity. We all sort of came together around having these informal chats, conversations with leaders, current and emerging leaders in adaptive, inclusive, and disability sport. And so really want to kick it off. I'll turn it over to Bob just to say a few words as well. But really looking forward to this conversation today with Ryan Martin with CUNY Athletics and also the Ryan Martin Foundation. Really going to hear from Ryan, some of the work he's doing at CUNY, and then just engage a conversation around some of the emerging topics, the innovations happening, other efforts that Ryan has been involved in, and kind of where some of his visions, his ideas. So before we jump over to Ryan, I'm going to pass it over to Bob just to say a few words and welcome everybody as well.
Yes, just want to take this time to welcome everybody, and especially Ryan Martin, and also want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, the Lakeshore Foundation, and Nick Pad, and Disability Sport International, the FAPA and IFAPA, and just appreciate everybody's involvement and really just keeping the discussion going of people with disabilities, having leadership, having innovation, and really just being providing a direction and guidance and vision for the future of our disability community, and just realizing that we do have leaders like Ryan and others that really have a direction and purpose that could guide our community into future endeavors and to being part of just the United States and as well as the world, and making sure that people with disabilities have a voice and a vision and moving forward. So thank you for everyone joining us today.
Excellent. And so we're going to stop the screen here, and we'll turn it over to Ryan to share his remarks. And we do want to mention that we do have the live stream for Otter service for transcription. So if you do need that, you can click on, and I'll share the link in the chat box as well. But we're going to turn over to Ryan now. So Ryan, over to you.
Bob, thank you for the introduction and the invite to join you guys and kind of discuss what we're doing at the City University of New York with their athletic conference, and just talk about inclusion and diversity in the area of adaptive sports. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So what I've kind of done, just to kind of level set some information for everybody who's on this call, because truthfully, I didn't know about CUNY and I grew up in Connecticut, right? So it's a little bit different. And so I'm just going to kind of go through a quick PowerPoint deck to kind of show everybody, kind of geographically where CUNY is, and talk about some of the makeup of students and, kind of the origin of the concept and the idea that we are currently implementing as far as an inclusive and adaptive athletics program. So to start with, the City University of New York is a combination of 25 different college campuses, senior colleges and two-year colleges, as well as graduate centers, School of Law, Professional Studies, Public Health. In over all of their campuses in undergrad and graduate school, they have about 500,000 students consistently. Okay? So this is kind of a brief breakdown geographically for a map as well. So it's spread out across all 5 of the boroughs. And what's unique about CUNY and my position there is I work for the athletic conference. And so I'm not tied to one individual campus. I'm tied to an entire system, and the largest system in the US for higher education. And so when you look at 500,000 students with undergrad and graduate school, you also are looking at roughly about 11,000 students with disabilities that are receiving services within the disability spectrum of services that are offered by the various campuses, and then from CUNY Central as well. So you have a critical mass there that is very unique. to not get too far into the weeds, just to kind of break down that number a little further. So, 11,000 students with disabilities, and about 4,500 of that 11,000 report a mobility impairment. Okay. So we've got pretty good data to show that we can develop a strategic plan from an inclusive and an adaptive initiative that's pretty unique. I think most universities initially struggle with having the critical mass of students with physical disabilities that would qualify to support a program. I know in other universities that I've been involved with helping design their program and implement some strategies, we always got back to where's the critical mass, where are students with disabilities. The one thing I would like to argue is, 11,000 out of, 500,000, that number is probably higher. But, we've got the issue of whether students disclose or not and different things like that. But at the very least, you're operating with a unique chasm because you're dealing with multiple campuses across the 5 boroughs, and then a higher demographic number as well. So some of this I've covered, but as far as the disability space, but it is truly one of the most diverse and most interesting universities that I've ever been associated with, just from, looking at the 5 pillars of diversity, right? And, I've spoke a little bit briefly about the disability numbers, right? So just on the other factors of diversity, right? And then, we can kind of look at the intersectionality of diversity of most of our student athletes, right? So we have 130 native languages, over 205 individual countries are represented by our student body, 30% people of color, 28% white, 27% Hispanic, 16% Asian. So you can see there the level of diversity and opportunity at CUNY is pretty unique, and it's what drew me to get involved with them, was because when I looked at the capacity to create a model that was sustainable because there was a critical mass consistently, and then a opportunity to do more than just create wheelchair basketball programming, right? I think when we look at the intercollegiate space around the US, we have a growing amount of wheelchair basketball programs, right? And I think part of that is attributed to the new leadership within the NWBA in really focusing the growth in the collegiate division. But we also see that there isn't as many opportunities in some of the other sports, right? So with the critical mass that we have, there's no reason why we can't provide tennis programming, track and field programming. And one of the other things that I thought we really could do with this program was really encourage authentic inclusion in the sports, whether that is, the Shaquem Griffin or an individual with that level of disability, where there is plenty of precedent in the NCAA space to have an amputee swimmer or different things in that matter. I feel like when you have a leadership group that we have within our inclusive and adaptive team that can educate coaches and educate individual campuses and athletic directors, I think you start to see more of those authentic opportunities, especially at the D3 level, where it is more of an opportunity to participate, and it doesn't have the same sort of scholarship restraints and different things like a D1 program or a P5 program. So obviously with the NWBA, the NCAA does not recognize wheelchair basketball currently as a sport. So we are joining the National Wheelchair Basketball Association, and we have one men's program and one women's program. Currently right now we have 25 student athletes that are spread out over 10 campuses, giving us a men's basketball program and a women's basketball program. And then we also have a few individual sport athletes that will compete in track and field with their able-bodied peers, and also in swimming as well at different campuses. So as I mentioned at the top, the potential for a very unique model at CUNY from a perspective of including inclusive and adaptive athletes is is kind of our target focus. So here's a little bit about the background of the NWBA. 3,000 plus members. Believe there is 16 different collegiate programs, and some men's and some women's programs. Obviously, such programs as University of Illinois and University of Texas Arlington, and then some of the new programs that have emerged out of the Southeastern Conference, SEC. Your Missouri, your Alabama, and who else am I missing? Auburn, excuse me. So a lot of different growth. So here is kind of a quick review of some of the points that we talked about with CUNY's plan for an inclusive and adaptive approach. So 11,000 students with disabilities. That also includes veterans. There is some intersectionality of, veterans with disabilities that also have other characteristics, on the, as we look at all the pillars of diversity as well. So I think I know we can create a model that is pretty unique. We're well along the way, even though it's a pandemic, and I'm sure we can discuss how we've pivoted to focusing the program during the pandemic time and supporting our student athletes and continuing to recruit into the next semester in those different areas. So that's kind of a high level overview of where we're at and what our focus is. So happy to kick off some conversation and dive into this. Looking forward to this discussion.
Excellent. No, thank you so much for that, Ryan, for that overview and kind of that perspective. And yeah, I think it'd be wonderful just to hear, just to kind of follow along. Yeah, to kind of just have a little bit more conversation about the program, and maybe even to share a little bit of your background and your story, kind of how you got passionate and engaged and interested, particularly to think about these kind of inclusive models, and also you working with Zach, and just some of the, just maybe tell a little bit more about the journey, and just maybe just to kind of fill us a little bit more, kind of how you got to this place with the initiative. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of started in the here and now and didn't give you kind of a background foundation to it. But
Okay.
so I've played wheelchair basketball my whole life. I played at Southwest Minnesota State, where I got my undergraduate degree in secondary education. I was born with spina bifida, and then both my legs were amputated above the knees at 2 years old. I had a really, really great opportunity through adaptive sports that really kind of continues over the last couple of years, getting a chance to play in the NWBA with the New York Knicks and win a few national championships with some of the greatest players that I think have played the sport. So I always look at my sporting career, as I assume I'm closer to the end than I am the beginning, right? As just having some great opportunities. I spent 10 years in Europe, playing professionally there, 8 in Spain, and 2 in France. And really, the opportunity to play professionally in Europe and get treated as a professional athlete is really kind of where I started to hone some of my thoughts on, my platform of what I can do. And I was just in the same circles with a lot of professional athletes, and they all had their golf tournaments and they all had their foundations and all this different stuff. And so I was speaking at Ray Allen, the NBA Hall of Famers basketball camp, and I was speaking to some of his kids, and I was looking out, and there's 200 kids, and they were all really super excited. And I was talking about, like coming from a small town, adopted and all those characteristics, but I still found basketball and found professional sports, kind of that basic motivational chat that you would give to athletes. And I was like, wow, there's not a single kid out here who I would say has a physical disability that I can see. Potentially there were some invisible ones, right? But that really bothered me. And I said it to enough people that it bothered me that they're like, well, why don't you do something about it? So I was like, well, okay. So we started doing basketball camps, and I formed my own nonprofit, the Ryan Martin Foundation, around 2011. And then we started doing camps in the US, and I was really happy to do that, right? Like I wanted to see, youth with disabilities in that Northeast region have opportunities that I didn't have, right? Like it just, I played basketball, but I played with an adult team, and it wasn't, you know, it was a great experience because it started me along the journey, but probably wasn't the best experience for me. And then it started expanding to, I started getting reached out by different, communities, different regions in the Northeast. And then at the time I was living in Madrid, and I thought that the opportunities for youth with disabilities in Spain was even further behind than what I saw in the US. So we created a flagship program in Madrid with Estudiantes, which is one of the ACB programs. The ACB, just for frame of reference, is the MBA of the Spanish league, widely considered the second best professional league for able-bodied basketball. And so worked with them to create kind of a grassroots program. And they have our junior program in Connecticut and our junior program in Madrid both kind of operate the same, with multiple camps during the summer for athletes, and then also, weekly engagements to participate in games and tournaments and different things of that nature. So I always kind of and that was kind of, I think, where I began thinking, like, why are there opportunities for kids without physical disabilities? And we're not trying to mirror the same thing. So, I think that is kind of, that's kind of always been my thought, is like, why can't we create that same level of opportunity, whether that's working, with a junior MBA program like we do with the Boston Celtics, or, whether that's, working with colleges to create programming there as well. I'm always wanting to create that same opportunity as organically as possible.
And so how do you, so just to dig a little bit more on the collegiate front and kind of where you see it going, what I know we're here with the current times and some of those challenges, and maybe talking about how you've been handling some of that, but also in terms of just evolving adaptive and inclusive sports at the, do you feel like this model with CUNY is one that can be replicated? Do you see it differently in different conferences? Like, so maybe some of the nuances of what you see happening, and also to talk a little bit about the intramural rec level, and also individual sport, team sport. So maybe just some of those different components.
Sure. Yeah. Ultimately, I'm not sure if the CUNY model is something that can be duplicated, right? It's such a large critical mass. You have so many campuses within 5 boroughs. Like, it's hard to get from one campus to another in under an hour. But I mean, geographically, you're talking, a few miles, spread out. So I don't know if those characteristics that really attracted me to the CUNY position when Dr. Rosa offered it to me are duplicatable. What I think is duplicatable is showing the value that these D2 and D3 campuses can have in fostering athletic opportunities. But from an overall perspective of creating multiple sports for both men and women, I'm not sure that's duplicatable. I would love to see more NCAA engagement of the of adaptive sports and inclusive sports opportunities, but I really think, the NCAA is a membership-driven institution, so I think it needs to come from the campuses. I think a lot of times people in our space say, well, hey, why isn't the NCAA doing this? Why isn't the NCAA doing that? And it doesn't quite work that way. I think it kind of works down from, from those member institutions saying, hey, we want to have this type of programming. I'm hopeful that we can get the critical mass of adaptive sports programming, which is 35 programs to be considered an emerging sports program. I think, that is one of the things under, new leadership that we have at the NWBA as a point of focus of our CEO, Will Waller, to kind of grow that level of the division. But to your point, I also think there's a tremendous growth opportunity in NERSA, right? As far as having a more of an inclusive model. I think one of the things being thrown into this CUNY model and having to rethink how adaptive sports can thrive on individual campuses, I think we need to acknowledge that there isn't just one way to do this, right? I think there's an option to do this on campuses through disability services. I think, through us, we're running it through kind of a hybrid, Zach Ikovich, who has been, who is our
Champion, yeah.
director of the CUNY Athletic Conference, he has been very, out and vocal about including inclusive and adaptive sports as part of, mainstream NCAA. And, so we are operating under a hybrid where, I'm working with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, but as well within athletics, right? But so I think there's multiple ways to do this. My concern, especially during the pandemic, is I think the collegiate landscape for sports, whether that's intramural, whether that's D1, D2, D3, are drastically going to change, right? I think things like Title IX, I think like the OCR, I think all of those things that kind of protect sports at the collegiate level are going to be really in for a fight when we start looking at the fiscal ramifications of reduced enrollment, and different things like that affect these various universities. So to me, I think, leadership around inclusive and adaptive sports needs to make sure we don't get confined to one paradigm and realize there's multiple ways to provide the opportunities for students with disabilities, right? Whether that is in an authentic NCAA manner where, programs are following, similar NCAA guidelines, whether that's a hybrid program, that's more of an inclusive model at NERSA where you maybe have, students without disabilities participating in sport, with students with disabilities. I think overall, we need to take a larger look at the landscape and realize that it's not just one way. There's not
many strategies.
Program implementation strategy.
I'll just do one more question before turning over to Bob for some questions. I'm also going to draw on Mary's question about the resources and the decisions that are made. I guess just one, I know that some of the universities you worked on, like UConn and others, you did a really great job, like sort of mapping and thinking about all the different stakeholders that need to come to the table and kind of that whole process of building the capacity. So maybe to talk about that, kind of how do you build those coalitions or how do you get people to really step up? But then also this question about the allocation of resources, in terms of how does it get prioritized? Are there, with CUNY, were there some negotiations or was it really having Zach as a champion? Maybe to talk about that, and then I'll turn it over to Bob.
Yeah, so I think there's there is two things. Let me take the first part with developing stakeholders, and and I always put that in the development bucket of my job. And I think one of the areas in inclusive and adaptive sports, whether that's wheelchair basketball and other sports, one of the areas that we need more leadership and more thought on is development, right? In creating financial sustainability, because there's not a single university out there that by the basis of their charter would disagree with this, right? If we look at any university, their job is to provide a equal and equitable education, right? And, provide robust experience of, student life versus just academic life, right? But the question becomes, you can only have what you can afford, right? So how do you create those stakeholders within that setting to bring in the revenue, to bring in the development? And fortunately, having my own NPO, like for years, has really kind of given me that understanding that, like, hey, it's great, I can wax poetic about all this equality and equity, but until I can fund it, I can't have it, right? And so creating stakeholders, creating external funding, corporate relationships, and then also kind of navigating the student experience, right? Athletic programs most likely won't have scholarships, but you have Access VR, you have Voc Rehab, to help students offset tuition costs, right? So I have to say about 95% of my job right now at CUNY has nothing to do with basketball. It's all, churning out grants, doing development work, engaging stakeholders, putting together an annual appeal to, CUNY alumni or CUNY students with disabilities who are graduates, right, for that sort of that support of the program. So I think ultimately, the development side is really the biggest need, you know, and I would be remiss. I got hired by Dr. Chris Rosa, who is the Vice Chancellor of Diversity and Inclusion at the City University of New York, right? So
Yeah.
this was one of the things that he wanted to have be a part of the platform for students with disabilities, but he is also an individual with a disability himself. And so I didn't have to convince Dr. Rosa what the value, or Zach, what the value of this program were to their students, right? They already drank the Kool-Aid, if you will. I think a lot of times at different universities, we're having to make that fight, right? We're having to make that fight that, like, yes, this is value. Yes, this is something that you should support. And I mean, ultimately, I think it's something that needs to be a point of pride at various universities, right? And it needs to be, you know, not something that's a silo program on a various corner of the campus. It needs to be integrated into the fabric of that university or that college. And I think CUNY, you know, even during this pandemic, has been really, really out in front as far as saying, like, hey, we support this program.
With the commitment, yeah.
And you're looking at such a university, you know, and I kind of shared with you some of the information at the beginning, is such a unique and diverse university that they just look at this as another form of their diversity.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think there's we have some good questions coming in, so we want to engage those. I also know we want to talk about innovation a little bit too, and some other things. But this question here from Doug is a great one about diversity and equity. You kind of touched on it. And then Nina is asking a great question about just how do we sell ourselves? You know, how does adaptive sports get the investment? You know, what are some of the ways you found in terms of the, you know, pitching to, you know, getting those sponsors on board? So yeah, why don't we go to these questions, and then I'd love.
Yeah, which one do you want me to take first?
Maybe do Nina's, because you touched on Doug's a little bit already, but yeah, maybe Nina's
Okay.
about the sponsors, and then we can kind of talk about the innovation aspect.
Yeah, so corporate funding, obviously during a pandemic, is quite a lift, right? But from my development standpoint, what we did at CUNY is we created this program called Recruiter in Residence, right? So you have all of these different New York City businesses and companies that need to hire a certain percentage of individuals with disabilities, right? And you want to provide them access. So what I've done is reach into my database of networking, and I've done a lot of corporate speaking at those individual places. You know, companies, you know, such as Walgreens, Travelers, companies that are really high on the Disability Employment Index. And I've engaged them separate from sports. I've engaged them and said, hey, we have a student body that fits your diversity needs and fits your innovation needs, right? Come tell them why they should work for your company, right? And so the sell isn't the sport. The sell is the value that they provide to their inclusive workforce and different things like that. And then the sell becomes like, well, hey, this all originated from having this program, you know, so let's support this program so we can continue to drive that, right? So everybody's asking corporations for money right now. And so, like, what sets you apart and how do you market yourself? So this was a funding strategy I used with my NPO very early on. The majority of our revenue annually is created through corporate engagement, right? So we develop job programs and work studies and mentorship programs with different individual employers because it allows us to engage their corporate giving side as well. And so just trying to, it's a slower process during the pandemic, but trying to create those same sort of relationships. And once again, like, I think this model holds fruitful over, you know, when we're out of this pandemic, because yes, this too will end at some point, you know, but it's now establishing those seeds, establishing those connections, right? And then ultimately what that allows you to do is now you're getting your student athletes through college and they have a networking ability of employers. So what you're doing is now you're taking your student athletes who you're recruiting with a promise of a college degree, and you're networking them through various employers that are disability focused, right? And so now you have a if you're talking about the full spectrum of what a collegiate adaptive sports program should be, from recruiting to sport to your transition away from campus into gainful employment, you've set that pipeline and you set that model. If done correctly, you've created enough funding.
Excellent. No, it's good to have that conversation as well. I know because you're part of, I think what's really interesting about your work and everything you've done, you really brought that business perspective, which I think is something that the adaptive sports and inclusive sports space needs to engage in even more. And there is a conversation, there's a follow-up question about the conferences.
Yeah.
As we're thinking about expansion, I know Ted, Ted's
Mhm.
a great colleague, part of the disability in sport, and but one of the strategies and efforts we've been that has been a part of the conversations at the collegiate level is how do we look across from a conference to conference perspective,
Sure.
and how do we build it? And so I guess thinking, that now you're working in your conference and thinking about other conferences and
Mhm.
kind of those strategies, you know, ho- understanding how the NCAA works and how these different, Division I, Division II, Division III, that's been something that we have talked about in terms of thinking about a conference strategy. Perhaps you can kind of speak to that a bit in terms of, and maybe not only in basketball, across different sports and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think that's also something that comes from the member campuses, right? Much like I don't think you'll see radical change from the NCAA until you see individual campuses and conferences advocating for that.
Working together.
Right? I don't think you're going to see the Big East, the SEC, the whatever the conference is, saying, hey, Clemson, we want you to do this, or hey, Georgetown, we want you to have this type of program. I don't think it's going to happen that way, right? I think it's more of the individual institutions getting started with a program and bringing it to their conference for discussion. And I mean, there's some kind of seeds in the SEC, and then Michigan and Illinois. Is that Big 12? Is that Big 10? They change all the time. It's Big 10, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Have to have the chat box.
You
see, experts.
You see some opportunity for that to happen, but I think, I really, it takes a longer time, but it starts from that grassroots, right? And enough grassroots push, enough university programs get involved, and then you have kind of create some seismic change.
And then there's also some really good questions coming in. I know Ryan, you and I have talked about a little bit about the gender and female participation and kind of that dynamic. And so perhaps, having women's adaptive athletes being the pioneers, is there ways to create inclusive model, male and female, but also just in terms of scholarships and Title IX. And so it's important, that's an important conversation about the dynamic of making sure we are being inclusive, men's and women's sports and kind of the growth in that way as well.
Yeah, and I think you see that we've had a greater level of success in creating men's programming versus women's programming. And I know at CUNY, like I felt that same thing, right? Like recruiting and engaging male athletes with disabilities has been way easier than female athletes with disabilities. But when I look at, I go back to the data, right? When I try to understand that, when I look at, the 500,000 students, and then I look at the 11,000 students with disabilities, it's a higher demographic of male versus female, right? So in the higher ed space, it's harder for that because I have less females that are enrolled as students, right? To start from there. And then when I start looking, okay, so if it's not already at the college level, where is it at the grassroots level, right? And it's not at the grassroots level either. And I mean, I think you can look at our barriers to inclusive and adaptive sports. Let's just throw out a few of them, whether we're talking grassroots or collegiate, funding, geographical location, and then just equipment access, right? Those are probably, and we could argue 1, 2, 3 where they are, right? But those are all 3 different, barriers. And I think what we've found, and especially with, the NWBA, is we've found that those barriers hit individuals of color and women harder than it does males. And so, we're committed at CUNY because, you can't beat the drum of inclusion and diversity and not follow the rules yourself, right? So we are committed to bringing in a women's wheelchair basketball program and including more female athletes, to the overall mission. But it is tough. It is definitely a challenge.
Gender piece. Yeah, no, it's important that we keep it on the front. And then there's a really great question about individual sports. So individual sports, the growth of individual sports, and then growth of team sports, and then also this additional, follow-up note about including athletes with and without disabilities, and kind of how that fits in. But I don't know, what do you think about, individual sports and are those an easier start perhaps? Is that team building a little more challenging? And how do we think about that, about including the people student athletes without disabilities? Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we've been able to do since I work for the athletic conference is I get to have a lot of engagement with individual athletic directors, whether it's at our 2-year schools or our 4-year campuses. And so there is just they're my colleagues, but I would be respectful in saying there's just a total lack of understanding of what inclusion looks like for them. And so part of what I look at as our team's job on campus is to show them what that looks like, right? Show them what that could be in the value, right? So these are all D3, mostly a few D2 campuses. So they're always D3 athletics, numbers feed the system, right? And so, they want to have 30 people swimming as opposed to just 15, right? And so showing them the value for the sustainability of their program, because adding more students in with an inclusive model gives them more funding from their individual campus, right? So I always try to lead with business. Like I bleed out of the heart for all this inclusion and diversity, but not everybody does. So I lead with the business, and I lead with the perceived value versus the actual financial return, right? And so we've had a lot of success in, pre-pandemic with, hey, these are some areas where we've had students who have reached out and want to swim on a D3 team, want to play tennis, with a prosthetic, and different things like that. But the lift there is easier, but it's educational to begin with, right? What does that look like? How does that work? How do we manifest these opportunities? I'm very confident because the responses have been great with this from the individual athletic directors when you can get them to see that. And so they don't get they struggle with seeing how to modify it. Our classification systems, why is, one athlete a 2.5 and why is one a 3.5? Because look at their athletic directors, they're looking for 40-yard dash, how many times you bench press, right? And they don't see, kind of some of the nuances that are, involved with inclusive sports and adaptive sports. But I honestly think our inclusion platform has a longer reach than our adaptive one does too, just because of the numbers, right? And
game, yeah.
I think, Dr. Cottingham at Houston has shown it's easier to start a small tennis program versus it is to put an entire wheelchair basketball program together. And I think, you're seeing Jeff Townsend having some success at Clemson, starting with tennis. I know Dr. O at Michigan as well, is doing that. So I think the blueprint that is out there for schools trying to get in the space is to start with the individual sports programs, right? And, tennis seems to be
good one, yeah.
one of those places that's providing a great opportunity.
Cool. Well, I'm going to turn over to Bob. And when Bob and I were preparing, we came up with some good kind of questions to get you thinking about innovation and leadership. And so I may turn it over to Bob for, kind of carrying it forward.
Thanks, Eli.
Thank you.
Yeah, we talked a little bit earlier, Ryan, about innovation of ideas, and no doubt you have with your business platform that really seems to be the great start, as you were saying, as you reach out into talking with athletic directors and getting into buy-in from an inclusion aspect. I guess really one of the first questions that comes to my mind is in regards to ideas. Um, are you the person that usually puts out ideas, or is it usually the athletic directors that come up with ideas for adaptive programs or inclusive programs? Or I guess really I'm just trying to find out, how does that conversation start in regards to, all right, we want to represent people with disability, and I'm an athletic director that probably doesn't have a disability, but this is what I think should happen. So is that usually how the conversation starts, or I guess just trying to get a feel in that regard?
Exactly.
So that's a great question, Bob. So if you ask my RMF board members, they would just be crazy old Ryans coming up with an idea, and now we got to figure out a way to make it viable. If you would ask the CUNY Athletic Conference and ask Dr. Rosa, one of the reasons I really like CUNY is because when I presented this model, they let me kind of run with it, you know, and said, okay. And Zach and Dr. Rosa do a really great job, and my colleagues within the athletic conference, of how do we get this to work, right? So all of my strategies have worked in Europe or worked at a grassroots level. So how do we make that work in the college space, right? And so I generally come up with an idea, and then I'm like, well, tell me why it doesn't, right? Or tell me why we shouldn't do it this way. And they kind of come back with, okay, well, this is how it could work on a 2-year campus. This is how it could work on a 4-year campus. This could be our overall vision, right? I love it because they're kind of just letting me create, and they're really supportive of, you know, as Zach says, he was like, if anybody gives you a hard time, just send them to me. And so like, it's created a work environment that I can really foster success under and be creative with. And I'm sure we're going to fail more often than we succeed, but I think they see the value of this with all of their students with disabilities, and then also just the profile that this gives the university, and then the students with disabilities on that university, right? You know, I think, you know, all of us being individuals with disabilities, we would say like, yeah, you know, so adaptive sports exist, but it's almost its own silo, right? So how do you get that out of the, you know, the recesses of, you know, some B Hall campus room, and make it a part of the university's fabric, right? And make it part of the university's fabric that's not just an ADA post once a year, you know, on the anniversary of the ADA, but how are they embracing it? How are they consuming it? And so I have to be honest, I was shocked because, you know, CUNY's corporate, and I thought I was gonna, you know, run into a lot of that, and I do from time to time, but for the most part, they've given me kind of free reign. Like, you know, one of the things we did is we created a virtual campus right now because due to the pandemic, all of our stuff in the fall semester is virtual, right? And so we've got our students doing virtual study tables. We've got our students doing one-on-one tutoring. You know, we've got a sports psychologist that works for the Brooklyn Nets who comes in and talks to our students about the mental preparation of sports. Our sports nutritionist, she comes in, and she could work in small groups or one-on-one as we talk about, you know, how do we prepare our athletes physically and mentally for return to play, you know, and all the stuff that they're dealing during the pandemic, right? So it was really incumbent on our team, like, to think holistically about what our student athletes are going through, especially during this time. And the virtual campus, if you will, has given us that opportunity to kind of think outside the box. And then also, I mean, for us, in some ways, it's been really great because how do you engage with 25 students on 10 campuses? Well, they all click a link, right? You know what I mean? And so like this has been unique, and it's kind of, candidly, I think my first Zoom call I did was with Eli in March, and he was like, wait, you don't have a Zoom account, Ryan? You're missing out. And I was like, Eli, I'll just FaceTime you, man. He's like, no, you need a Zoom account. And so like now I've got probably about 7 or 8 Zooms a day. So, you know, I think there is, if there is a silver lining in all of this pandemic, especially in New York City, which, you know, I would be remiss to say how it's impacted the city and the university. You know, it has been that we've been able to create a cohesive community and a cohesive environment through, you know, this virtual platform. Listen, I miss hearing wheels squeak and watching guys make 3-point shots and, you know, teaching the fundamentals of the game. But I mean, in the interest of moving the initiative forward, you know, like in March when everything shut down, It was, okay, so we had this whole entire plan. Now, mind you, this plan's never been done anywhere, but now we have to reboot this entire plan just to get back to a point in a place where we can go back to our original thought process. So a little bit is hang on to dear life and create on the fly.
Excellent. Bob, maybe do you want to ask your question about innovation, and then we can go to the chat for some more? I just
Sure.
think it's a really good one. I want to make sure we can get Ryan's to think about that question about.
Yeah.
Also, just a different perspective, and then we'll get to more of the chat. Yeah.
Well, you kind of briefly touched on it a little bit, Ryan, in regards to sometimes you'll just shoot out on ideas, and no doubt it looks like they're looking for you to be those ideas. And you even made the statement, you know, the idea can be far-fetched, but that's fine, because the more absurd an idea is, as to quote Einstein, you know, a great idea first starts in the realm of absurdity, and then as you take that prototype and whittle it down, you will then come up with your great idea. So I guess really that was kind of the question to throw out there is I think it's great that you're going to those leaders and talking to them about, you know, ideas that may seem foreign to them and outside the box and off the, something they probably can't relate to, being a person without a disability. So really, I guess just the question comes out to be, you know, the ideas that you think that are kind of far-fetched, that's good that you have those and keep having those, and because that's really where the great idea will come from. And I guess really just wanted to get your thought on that type of thinking.
Yes. So I think some of the way like I think about things is outside the box and maybe a little bit different, but I think that's part of my nonprofit background that one of my colleagues within the board of, directors, Mike Godsey, always says like, you can't eat what you don't kill, right? So like, you got to be creative in development. You got to be creative in revenue generation, right? What I think I always base my idea on is I'll see opportunities for individuals without disabilities who play sports, and why aren't we giving that to our adaptive athletes? Like, for example, right? So I started working with a sports psychologist. I think it was my second year in Madrid when I was playing, because I had what, the golfers call the yips, right? I would have wide open layups and I would throw that off the bottom of the rim. And I couldn't figure out because as soon as everybody left the arena, like I would do that 100 times and 99 of them would go in. And I was like, wait, this is really affecting my mortgage, right? If I keep missing these layups, they're going to stop paying me, right? So I looked and saw what able-bodied athletes were doing, and they were talking to, sports psychologists and, all that different stuff. So I was like, well, if I ever have this type of program, I want to incorporate some of that mental training, right? Because I believe, having played professionally and having played so long, and I would consider myself not a great athlete, but like, I think as an athlete, and Bob, and Eli, you guys can appreciate it, physically, you're only going to get to one point, right? And maybe you can tweak it, maybe your recovery, maybe your nutrition gets you a little bit higher, but where is that final frontier of reaching your zenith as an athlete? It's in that mental, right? Like, how much growth can you make in that standpoint? So, including that as in part of our, our virtual campus, as we transition was a no-brainer, including a nutritionist for a population of individuals who were going to be sedentary because they're locked in their New York City apartments for several months seemed like a no-brainer, right? Because that's what they were doing with able-bodied athletes at the time to advise them. So I think a lot of my ideas in sport come from what I see, in the arena of able-bodied sports, and like, how do we modify that? How do we adapt that? And how do we take that perceived value for this population and give it to that population?
Cool. Thanks, Ryan, for that. There's a question from Amy that I wanted to touch on, but I wanted to do it in the context of there's a lot of data that comes out along like race and gender in terms of coaches and minorities into hiring into leadership positions. And I guess, do you have a sense that there's good data in terms of equity and equity for coaches with disabilities or others with disabilities in sports athletic positions? Or do you feel like we need to collect more of this kind of data to kind of help us make the case? Because one of the things that's made a lot of difference in with gender and race has been a lot of really good reports and data that's helped to show and keep reminding us about the few people in coaching and leadership positions. And so Amy's
Yeah, I
question
would
is
love
specifically
to.
around coaching, but I thought it extended a little bit in terms of just data, not only in coaching, but in other types of roles as well.
Yeah, so I would like to see more data on that. And as far as the impact, one of the questions that I think is interesting, if I can kind of take this question and twist it a little bit, Eli, is, should your adaptive sports athletes be people with disabilities, right? Is there, and I think you have that same sort of argument. Should a WNBA team be coached by a woman or should it be coached by a man? And different things like that. I think there is a value at some of the grassroots level of adaptive sports, that mentorship that happens when the coach has the physical disability, and there's that relatability for an athlete. At the higher levels, like, when I played professionally in Europe, it didn't matter to me if that person was a person with a disability or not, because I already knew the sport. I needed somebody who could manage the game, right? And I wasn't looking, I was looking for somebody who knew how to call timeouts when we were on, when the other team was on a 10-2 run. So I think that is really interesting. And I'd like to see some more data on that, that having that representation in the coaching space or, the admin space as well.
Yeah, that might be something that needs to, to continue to be done.
More research for you, Eli.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Amy's, we're like, this is definitely an area that needs to be done. But there are some, I know Mary is chiming in with some work that is being, so I think it's part of the evolution of like, where can we continue to gather some of this information. Another question kind of around the leadership and thinking about like chancellors and presidents and kind of all the people that are in leadership positions. I tend to think about, has that also been a strategy that you've thought about in terms of building it out? Like, that's in the way that we see influence happening, presidents are talking to presidents, chancellors to chancellors. So maybe in terms of thinking about as we're building to other conferences that, the CUNY leaders could be talking to the other, conferences and so forth.
Yeah, and I think some of that happens, right? When
to happen,
when I started working with our team at CUNY to develop, our strategic plan for, year 1 through 5, if you will, I was reaching out to Doug Garner at UTA, and I was reaching out to Steph Wheeler at U of I, just to kind of, hey, like day to day, like what am I missing? What am I not thinking about, right? And I know with CUNY, they reached out a lot to Edinburgh University, and then they reached out a lot to, some of the different other programs that were kind of starting the process.
At the highest level, so athletic directors, they were talking to.
Yeah, I mean, reaching along, like vice chancellors were reaching out to other university level folks that, similar, athletic directors as well. I just don't think we necessarily have enough champions in the space, right? We always, I know you, me, and Ted, we always used to, at the beginning, you talk about, hey, you need a champion on campus to carry the flag, carry the flags, and you need somebody with some influence to kind of really push that. And I look at the places that I've been a part of to help them develop programming, and like the one common denominator is like, and the one thing that I think is going to allow us to be long-term successful at CUNY is like they came asking for this, right? It wasn't a request of like, hey, we should try this model, we should build this, we should do this type of programming. They came in and they looked at, what is universal design? What is an inclusive experience for students with disabilities? Well, that's everything, right? That's sport, that's extracurricular. And so if you have that level of buy-in from the university, I think that is 90% of the battle.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, just in terms of like, how do you seed people to engage? Like, if they haven't thought of the idea or they're not there yet, like somehow they have to get the idea and take it on as their own idea. They have to feel like they're not being told what to do, or so I really,
especially in higher ed, especially in higher education.
You have to be strategic and kind of influence them.
Yeah, and I think this is a lot of where we're seeing, you know, kind of mainstream, mainstream marketing and, you know, the portrayal of adaptive athletics, you know, whether that's the Olympics and whether that's, you know, big corporations getting involved in that. We're starting to see it more mainstreamed. I think the USOPC changing their name and, you know, like CUNY is involved with the, the Paralympians made here. That has really given a lot of traction. And so I think, you know, what we've seen is we've seen more campuses investigate this, right? Look into this. Where do they fit on the landscape? But you still need a champion on that campus who's going to say, yeah, we want this. Let's figure out how to do it, because there is no, you know, one size fits all model, right? What we're doing at CUNY, you know, I mentioned might not be, you know, translatable to another campus. You know, what Coach Garner down at UTA is doing might be a little more translatable because, you know, the way they run it, the way, you know, Coach Wheeler at U of I runs her program, you know, that's something that's translatable. So I think us not limiting growth in just one area, you know, I mean, like you and I have talked a lot about NERSA, right? You know, how much more growth could we have if a student with a disability could play wheelchair basketball every Tuesday night at the, you know, Boston University, right? And, you know, you're providing that opportunity. So I think there's multiple models, and maybe probably the maddening part for people who want to see growth is like, well, where is the growth model from like a, you know, from a macro level? That's really hard to say.
We have a couple more minutes, and I guess
Sure.
I had one question, just because it's sort of more related to what informs you and how you kind of get your information, not only about sport, but just more broadly. And so I always think it's interesting, like if you could recommend like a good book or a movie or something that you think has like really helped inspire and inform you to what you're doing. Oftentimes it's like a book, like, you know, I really recommend everyone read this book because this is going to help change your perspective about innovation and leadership and inclusion. And so I thought maybe just kind of one of the wrap-up questions. I'll probably turn it to Bob for a final question, but do you have like something you'd recommend to people out there, like from a leadership perspective, innovation?
These are my favorite questions. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Kind of a different kind of question, but yeah.
Yeah, no. So what, you know, how do you feed the brain so you can kind of be creative with it? So I actually, I've gotten into kind of a pseudo book club with Brad Stevens of the Celtics, and part of our working relationship with the junior NBA and the junior Celtics. And so this is, I try to read everything that he recommends to me, you know. So I read Ranges by David Epstein most recently, you know, and I really liked, you know, and it kind of goes to what Bob was talking about, like, how do you form your decisions, right? You know, and we always talk about like specializing and just like, hey, I'm an expert in this, but you know, you're better off with, you know, kind of a generic overview understanding and kind of thinking outside that box instead of trying to just, you know, go with one way. I thought that was a great book. That was really good. I'm trying to think.
Good. I'm sure we're all taking notes. You know, we're gonna.
What's that? Yeah, right. I'll put my book list in there.
Put it in the chat box.
You know, I read Good to Great. I thought that was
great, yeah.
I thought that was good. This is all during quarantine, obviously, so I've had a lot of time apparently. I've read a couple books. I read Pat Summitt's book. I read Coach Wooden's book. Trying to think. There's one other book that I read that I really enjoyed it, and I just can't. It's Legends. Legends is a great book. Anybody in the sporting space who hasn't read Legends, I'd highly recommend that. And the author takes a look at the commonality of great teams across, you know, and they point to great leadership from players, not necessarily coaches or administrators in the organization. And they paint this New Zealand rugby team as the most successful program or successful sports team ever. And so it starts talking about some of their core values and beliefs. That was probably the best book I've read.
Yeah, rugby.
Awesome.
Love it.
Yeah, rugby
What's that?
book.
Yeah, rugby. Yes, love it.
Yeah.
We're right up on
Rugby
the
players.
we're right up on the hour, but I don't know, Bob, do you want to have any kind of concluding remarks? Obviously, I want to
Just,
thank you. And
yeah, I just want to thank Ryan and everyone that participated. Thank you so much for your questions and your candor, Ryan, and making this a very successful discussion. Thank you.
and then
Yeah,
we'll have
no,
a
and I mean, I'm
upcoming
looking at some of the
conversation.
questions, man, these are some great questions and we didn't get to all of them.
Yeah, we tried to get a bunch. I know, we have a really great community here, and many people that are really engaged, and so really looking forward to all the follow-up. And we'll circulate, and our next conversation is November with Jeremy Snyder, and then we have 2 in December. But no, it's great, Ryan, to have you to kind of get us back to these talks. And so I think we're going to close out here shortly, but thank you all, and thank you, Ryan, and thank you all the collaborators.
Yeah, no,
we'll-
this was a lot of fun. It was better than talking about testing protocol for return to play. So
exactly. Well, I'm going to stop
great.
recording. Yeah.